This is a story about a man named Greg, a man who thought he had the world figured out. At 50 years old, Greg ran a small business in a quiet Midwestern town, living by rules he believed were carved in stone. Stick to your own kind, trust no one different, and always look out for yourself first. But all that changed the day he died. Or, as Greg would later say, the day he almost died. In those moments, Greg claims he crossed into the afterlife, where he was shown shocking truths about himself, his beliefs, and the world. What he saw will challenge everything you think you know. For Greg, it was just another Thursday. The morning started like any other, coffee in his favorite mug, a quick glance at the headlines, and then out the door to open his hardware store. It wasn't a glamorous life, but Greg liked it that way. He thrived on routine, on knowing what to expect. Greg's shop had been in the family for decades. It wasn't fancy, but it was steady. He knew most of his customers by name, and they knew him as a man of few words and strong opinions. Greg wasn't shy about sharing his views, especially when it came to people who, in his mind, didn't belong. He'd never been violent or openly hateful, but his prejudices were no secret. That afternoon, Greg started feeling off. A sharp pain shot through his chest, spreading to his arm. "It's just stress," he told himself, brushing it off. But the pain didn't go away. It got worse. Greg tried to stand, but his legs gave out beneath him. The last thing he remembered was falling to the floor of his shop, his vision going dark as the sound of customers calling his name faded into silence. When Greg opened his eyes again, he wasn't in his shop, or at least it didn't feel like it. He was surrounded by a brilliant, all-encompassing light. It wasn't blinding or harsh. Instead, it felt warm, almost alive. At first, Greg thought he was dreaming. The pain in his chest was gone, and he felt lighter, freer than he ever had before. He tried to speak, to call out, but his voice didn't seem to work. Instead, his thoughts seemed to echo around him, as if the light could hear him. "Where am I?" he wondered, and the answer came not in words, but in a deep, resounding sense of calm. Greg began to move, or at least it felt like moving. He wasn't walking so much as drifting, drawn towards something in the distance. Shapes began to form in the light, shifting and changing until they took the shape of a figure. It wasn't someone Greg recognized, but it felt familiar. The figure radiated love and understanding, and for the first time, Greg felt truly seen. "You've come to learn," the figure said. The voice wasn't harsh or judgmental, but it carried a weight that Greg couldn't ignore. "There's much to show you." The figure that stood before Greg wasn't intimidating or frightening, but it held an undeniable authority. It was neither male nor female, but its presence was overwhelming. A blend of warmth, wisdom, and something Greg couldn't quite name. He wanted to speak, to ask questions, but before he could, the figure raised a hand. "You've lived your life with blinders on," it said. "But now, you will see." In an instant, Greg was surrounded by images, not memories, exactly, but snapshots of moments he didn't fully understand. He saw himself sitting in his shop, dismissing a young woman looking for work because it's not a place for someone like you. He saw himself ignoring a neighbor who had reached out for help, thinking, "They'll just take advantage of me." Each scene hit Greg like a punch to the gut, forcing him to confront the casual cruelty of his own actions. The guide's voice broke through the images. "You've judged others without knowing them," it said. "Now you'll see the harm it's caused." The next vision hit Greg harder than any of the others. He was shown scenes from his own life, not just from his perspective, but from the eyes of those he had hurt. He saw the young woman he had turned away from his shop. She was crying in her car, her hands trembling as she texted her friend. Another rejection. "I don't know how much more of this I can take." Greg wanted to look away, but the vision continued. He saw his neighbor, an elderly man who had once asked Greg for help repairing his roof. Greg had waved him off, muttering about how people like that shouldn't rely on handouts. Now, Greg saw the man struggling alone, climbing a shaky ladder and nearly falling. Each scene was like a stone added to Greg's chest, making it harder to breathe. He wanted to shout, to explain, but the guide's voice stopped him. "You've lived in fear," it said, "but fear is no excuse for harm." The guide then showed Greg something even more difficult to bear: the ripple effects of his actions. It wasn't just the individuals he had wronged. It was the way his attitudes and words had spread, influencing others. He saw his own children, now grown, repeating the same dismissive phrases he had used. He watched as his son ignored a coworker who needed help, saying, "Not my problem." He saw his daughter avoiding classmates in school because they looked different. Greg's heart sank as he realized the full extent of his influence. "I didn't mean for this to happen," he said, his voice breaking. But the guide's response was firm. Intention doesn't erase impact. The final vision was the hardest to watch. Greg saw a community fractured by division, neighbors turning against one another, each group clinging to their own and blaming others for their struggles. It wasn't just his actions that had contributed to this. It was a collective failure to choose understanding over fear. Greg's despair was interrupted as the guide's tone softened. "But it doesn't have to stay this way," it said. The light around Greg shifted again, and he found himself standing in a vibrant, bustling community. People of all races, cultures, and ages were working together, sharing laughter, stories, and kindness. He saw families gathering for shared meals in parks, children playing without a care about who looked different from whom, and neighbors helping each other rebuild homes damaged by a storm. The air buzzed with energy, not just the absence of conflict, but the presence of genuine connection. "This is what could be," the guide explained. "A world where differences are not walls, but bridges." Greg felt a strange mixture of hope and sadness. The vision was beautiful, but it felt so far removed from the reality he knew. He couldn't imagine how people could overcome their fears and biases to build something like this. "Every great change starts small," the guide said, as if reading Greg's thoughts. "It starts with you." The light dimmed again, and Greg found himself watching scenes from America's past and present. He saw moments of great achievement, civil rights marches, landmark speeches, and people fighting for equality. But he also saw the darker side: injustice, hatred, and the pain caused by centuries of division. Greg watched as leaders stoked fear to gain power. Communities turned inward out of distrust, and people clung to their biases, unwilling to see the humanity in others. He felt the weight of history pressing down on him, the overwhelming realization that these struggles weren't abstract. They were personal. He had been part of the problem, even in small ways. "This is where fear leads," the guide said. "But the path forward is always open." The guide then showed him recent moments of hope. People coming together after tragedies, standing up for justice, and refusing to let hatred win. Greg realized that even amidst the struggles, there were always those who chose love over fear. And for the first time, he wondered if he could be one of them. The guide turned Greg's attention to a vision of America in the near future, just after the 2024 presidential election. The scene began in chaos. Protests in the streets, arguments erupting on news channels, and people divided more than ever. Greg could feel the tension, the anger bubbling beneath the surface. But then, the focus shifted. Greg saw the newly elected president addressing the nation, their voice calm but firm. They didn't promise to fix everything overnight or to be perfect, but they spoke with sincerity, calling on Americans to remember their shared humanity. "We've forgotten how to listen to each other," the president said, "but it's never too late to begin again." The guide showed Greg the ripple effects of this leadership. Communities began holding town halls where people could share their stories without judgment. Leaders at every level, mayors, teachers, pastors, took up the challenge of bridging divides. It wasn't easy, and it wasn't instant, but Greg saw the beginnings of change. "This is what happens when people choose unity," the guide said. Greg couldn't help but feel a flicker of hope wondering if he might live to see this future. The guide then showed Greg what could happen if people continued to live in fear and division. He saw a world where fences replaced open yards, where conversations were replaced by silence, and where communities that once thrived were now fractured. Greg watched as families drifted apart, mistrust grew, and opportunities were lost because people refused to work together. He saw his own community, once close-knit, falling into disrepair. Businesses closed, schools struggled, and loneliness became the norm. "This is the price of fear," the guide said. "It doesn't just hurt others. It steals your own peace." Greg felt tears well up in his eyes. For the first time, he understood how much his own fear had cost him. Friendships he could have made, opportunities he could have embraced, and joy he could have shared. The guide then led Greg to a place that felt different, calmer, quieter, and more personal. Greg saw faces begin to appear around him. Some were familiar, people he had judged or dismissed, neighbors he had ignored, and coworkers he had wronged with his words. Others were strangers, but Greg knew they had been affected by the ripple effects of his actions. Greg felt a lump in his throat. He wanted to speak, to apologize, but the words wouldn't come. Instead, one of the figures stepped forward, their expression soft. "We forgive you," they said simply. The guide explained that forgiveness wasn't just for the one who received it. It was for the one who gave it, too. "Letting go of anger and resentment frees the soul," the guide said. "But true healing requires you to seek forgiveness as well." Greg watched as the figures began to fade, leaving him with a profound sense of both relief and responsibility. He realized that forgiveness wasn't just about saying sorry. It was about changing, about living differently moving forward. After the emotional weight of seeking and granting forgiveness, Greg found himself enveloped in a radiant, all-encompassing light. The guide spoke once more, its voice both comforting and commanding. "Now you must see what binds us all." The light shifted, and Greg saw people from every corner of the world, different races, religions, and backgrounds, working together in harmony. A farmer shared his harvest with a struggling family. A doctor treated patients without concern for their ability to pay. Neighbors rebuilt homes after a storm, their differences irrelevant in the face of shared humanity. "This is the spirit of unity," the guide said. "It's within every one of us, waiting to be awakened." Greg felt a warmth in his chest, a deep sense of connection that he'd never known before. He realized that every division he'd ever clung to, us versus them, right versus wrong, was a barrier he built himself. In truth, the only way forward was through unity, through recognizing that every life was intertwined. The guide then posed a question that struck Greg to his core. "Will you carry this spirit back with you, or leave it here?" Greg's next vision was filled with small but powerful acts of kindness. He saw a young girl helping an elderly man cross a busy street, a nurse staying late to comfort a scared patient, and a teacher using their own money to buy supplies for their classroom. These weren't grand gestures, but their impact was undeniable. "Compassion is the foundation of unity," the guide said. "It doesn't take wealth, power, or status, only the willingness to care." Greg was reminded of moments in his own life when he could have shown compassion, but chose not to. He remembered the time a struggling mother had come into his shop, asking for an extension on her bill. He'd turned her away, citing policy. Now he saw how that decision had added to her burden, how a simple act of kindness could have made all the difference. The guide showed Greg a future where compassion became a guiding principle, not just for individuals but for entire communities. Schools taught empathy alongside math and science. Workplaces prioritized fairness and understanding. Even in difficult times, people chose to help rather than hurt. Greg realized that compassion wasn't just about being kind. It was about building a better world, one small act at a time. The guide then brought Greg to a place that could only be described as heavenly. It wasn't clouds and golden gates, but a realm of perfect peace and harmony. People from every background were together, their differences celebrated rather than erased. There was music, laughter, and a profound sense of belonging. Greg noticed that there was no competition, no jealousy, no fear. Everyone worked together for the good of all. A man who once harbored bitterness now helped his former rival build a home. A woman who had been wronged in life now extended her hand in friendship. It was a vision of what the world could be if people let go of hate and embraced love. "This is not a reward," the guide said. "It is the natural result of living with an open heart." Greg was overwhelmed by the beauty of the scene, but he also felt a pang of regret. He realized how far he had been from living this way. But the guide reassured him, "It's never too late to start." The guide then showed Greg how leadership, at every level, played a critical role in fostering unity. Greg saw leaders who inspired rather than divided, who listened more than they spoke, and who prioritized the well-being of all over personal gain. He saw a mayor in a small town organizing community events that brought people together. He saw a teacher guiding students to understand different perspectives. He even saw a young boy standing up to a bully, showing courage that inspired his classmates to do the same. The vision shifted to the national stage. Greg saw the newly elected president delivering a speech not filled with promises, but with a call to action. "We cannot fix this alone," the president said, "but together, there's nothing we can't achieve." Greg realized that leadership wasn't just about titles or power. It was about taking responsibility, setting an example, and encouraging others to do the same. The guide's voice echoed in his mind. "You don't have to lead a nation to be a leader. You can start with your family, your neighbors, your community." The guide then showed Greg the reality of change. It wasn't easy. He saw people struggling to confront their own biases, to unlearn habits that had been ingrained for years. He saw families arguing over dinner tables, communities divided over how to move forward, and individuals doubting whether change was even possible. "Changing minds is the hardest work of all," the guide said, "but it is also the most important." Greg saw examples of people persevering despite the difficulties. A man who once held prejudiced views joined a community group and discovered common ground with those he had once judged. A woman who had been afraid to speak out found her voice and became an advocate for her neighbors. Greg also saw himself in this vision, stumbling but continuing to try. He reached out to the people he had wronged, listened to their stories, and shared his own. It wasn't always smooth, but it was real. The guide's words stayed with him. Change doesn't come from perfection. It comes from persistence. The guide's voice grew serious as Greg's next vision unfolded. "Now you must see what happens if people stop trying," it said. The light shifted, and Greg found himself back in his own town, but something was wrong. The streets were empty, businesses were shuttered, and a heavy silence hung in the air. Greg saw neighbors who once worked together now ignoring one another. Fear and mistrust had taken over. Fences divided yards where children once played, and even the small acts of kindness that held the community together had disappeared. "This is the cost of complacency," the guide said. "When people believe the work is done, division creeps back in." Greg saw himself in this future, isolated and bitter. He had stopped reaching out, stopped caring, and the weight of his loneliness was unbearable. The guide explained that unity isn't a one-time achievement. It's a constant effort, a choice made every day. Greg's chest tightened as he realized the truth. Change wasn't permanent unless it was nurtured. He vowed then and there never to let complacency take root in his life again. The light around Greg softened, and he saw a vision of a classroom filled with students of all backgrounds. A teacher stood at the front, not lecturing, but guiding a discussion. The students shared their thoughts openly, learning not just from textbooks, but from each other. Education is the key, the guide said. Not just knowledge, but understanding. Greg watched as schools became places of growth, not just academically, but emotionally. Children were taught empathy alongside reading and math, learning how to listen, communicate, and resolve conflicts. Parents attended workshops on fostering inclusion, and community centers held events where people shared their stories. One vision stood out: a town hall meeting where people from opposing viewpoints sat down to talk. At first, the tension was palpable, but as the meeting went on, barriers began to break. People started to see each other not as enemies, but as neighbors. Greg realized that dialogue was a bridge, one that required courage to cross. He saw himself joining these conversations, not to argue, but to listen and grow. The guide turned to Greg, its presence both comforting and firm. "You've seen what was, what is, and what could be," it said. "Now it's time to return." Greg felt a sudden pull, as if he were being drawn back through the light. He opened his eyes to the beeping of monitors and the worried faces of his family around him. His wife gasped, clutching his hand. "You're back," she cried, tears streaming down her face. Greg's body ached, and his mind was flooded with memories of what he had seen. At first, he struggled to make sense of it. Had it all been a dream? But the clarity and emotion of the experience left no doubt. It was real. In the days that followed, Greg began to share his story. At first, people were skeptical, but as he spoke, his sincerity became undeniable. Greg wasn't the same man who had collapsed in his shop. He was softer, more open, and determined to live differently. Greg's life began to change in small but profound ways. He started by reaching out to those he had wronged, apologizing for his past actions. Some accepted his apology immediately, while others were hesitant. But Greg didn't give up. He listened, learned, and showed through his actions that he was committed to being better. He also began to get involved in his community in ways he never had before. He joined a local volunteer group, helping to organize events that brought people together. He even opened his shop to workers from all backgrounds, offering fair wages and a welcoming environment. One of Greg's most impactful changes was within his own family. He had honest conversations with his children, acknowledging his past mistakes and encouraging them to see the world differently. They were hesitant at first, but Greg's consistency won them over. His transformation became a ripple effect, inspiring his family and friends to reflect on their own lives. Greg's journey ended with a realization that stayed with him for the rest of his life. Love isn't just a feeling, he often said. It's a choice to see the best in people, to forgive, to connect, and to build something better together. Greg dedicated his life to sharing this message. He spoke at schools, churches, and community gatherings, not as a preacher, but as a man who had seen the cost of hatred and the power of love firsthand. His story resonated with people from all walks of life, inspiring them to make small changes that led to big differences. "This is what I've learned," Greg would say. "We're all connected. Our choices don't just affect us, they affect everyone around us. And when we choose love, we're not just making our own lives better, we're making the whole world better." Greg's story is a reminder that it's never too late to change, to grow, and to choose a better path. It's an invitation to all of us to look beyond fear and embrace the power of love.